Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And welcome to our webinar entitled Just Energy Transition Partnerships, JETPs. What do we need to know to assess them? Please do write down your name in the chat and let us know where you're connecting from. My name is Tetet Lauron. I am with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And I'm greeting you all from Dubai, where I'm attending the COP28 climate negotiations. So we'd like to introduce UNRISD briefly. The United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, UNRISD, is an autonomous research institute within the UN system that is on a mission to address the social dimensions of contemporary development issues. Since 1963, UNRISD has asked the difficult questions on neglected issues in development processes about power, politics, and distribution. We work with a global network to undertake cutting-edge interdisciplinary research and policy analysis. Our ultimate goal is to support transformative change through positioning equity, inclusion, and justice at the center of sustainable development policy and practice. As part of UNRISD's environmental and climate justice program's ongoing work with the Just Transition Research Collaborative, this webinar will examine Just Energy Transition Partnerships, or JETPs in short. JETPs promise to deliver quickly and effectively on just energy transitions in a select few developing countries. However, forged among a small group of partners outside the multilateral climate policy space, it's not yet clear how ambitious, just, and inclusive they really are. For the past year, UNRISD has been convening in partnership with Climate Action Network, Public Services International, and the Fossil Fuels Non-Proliferation Treaty, a series of conversations which highlighted important areas of convergence among researchers and different voices of civil society. Today, we will be introducing the outcomes of those dialogues and hear from our exciting panel their views on how this common framework for assessing JETP's performance applies to their different realities and needs. And today's webinar is brought to you thanks to the support of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and UNRISD funding partners. We are grateful for their support. A little housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and made available on the UNRISD website and YouTube channel. The chat box in this webinar, I'm sure you're experts on this already, is available for comments and sharing resources and relevant materials to the webinar's main themes and topics. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We will be posing your questions to the panelists in the Q&A section. Finally, your feedback is important for us, and it would definitely help us to improve. Once the webinar is over, you will be prompted to complete a survey about the event. The survey is anonymous and will only take a few moments. So please, we highly encourage you to help us improve our work. So let's get started. We will first get an introduction to the main elements of convergence today, summarized in the policy brief, followed by inputs from our speakers, who I will introduce one by one as we move along. We will then let them reflect on one or two rounds of questions and should then have some time left to open up the floor for questions, comments from the audience before we wrap up. So as I've said, you can submit your questions at the Q&A box at any time during the webinar. All right? So let's get this show started. I'd like now to introduce to you our very good friend, Anabella Rosemberg, to introduce the policy brief. Anabella is a global expert on the social justice dimension of environmental and climate policies. She works as a senior advisor on just transition for Climate Action Network International and UNRISD. Anabella has worked as the International Program Director at Greenpeace International from 2018 until 2023 And before that, and very relevant to the work today, at the International Trade Union Confederation, ITUC, where she worked globally with unions and other allies in many countries, particularly in the Global South, in advancing a just transition as a framework to advance labor and environmental concerns together. So, Anna, welcome. And let me throw the first question to you. You held a series of conversations on JETPs over the summer. Can you set the scene for us? Why do we need to talk about JETPs and what should we be looking at? Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, my dear sister Tetet. I mean, what a pleasure. I mean, to be together in Dubai, actually not physically in the same room, but at the same time in this event. And thanks so much, I mean, for the introduction and for gathering this whole audience in our event, also for seeing so many friends in the chat. So welcome to you all. Indeed, as you were saying, we have had a few of those convenings. So I wanted to share with you some of those results, which are indeed in the policy brief that hopefully you had a look. I'm going to be sharing my screen for a moment so that we can capture some of those key lessons in the slides. So give me one little second so that I can show those to you. Here you go. So, and appreciating also the beautiful work that our colleague Sergio in UNRWA has been doing to make this beautiful screen here. So what I'm going to be sharing, and on the why, I mean, it's important to talk about JETPs and also what some of those conversations that we had with, I mean, more than 60 organizations in the past year is giving you a little bit of a sense of the background, where we're coming from. This information is quite widely available, but also trying to come, I mean, and bring together in a probably, hopefully, an organized way some of those major concerns, but probably more proactively start building up or shaping an agenda for demands that could hopefully improve and better assess those just energy transition partnerships. So maybe a word first about the Just Transition Research Collaborative. I mean, this is not the first work that UNRWA does on just transition. Of course, just transition is today like the talk in town. I mean, there are many, many institutions working on it, but I think it's we also wanted to share with for the ones that have not been necessarily in touch with UNRWA before. I mean, the seminar report that was released in 2018, mapping different approaches to just transition, the book with different stories of different stakeholders that have engaged on this, in all the series of webinars and conversations about different aspects of the just transition discussion, whether we're talking about feminist perspectives on it, we're talking about global north-south dimensions, and whether we're talking about experiences from the ground. So there is a really diverse, I mean, like diverse pieces of work on just transition that are coming from this collaborative that is bringing together a lot of academics and practitioners working on just transition from around the world. Maybe a word as well about the in an extremely succinct manner. I mean, I will not be doing justice to neither of the spaces, the multilateral spaces that I'm going to mention, but I think it's important to situate internationally, and in particular in the multilateral system, how the conversations on just transition are being framed and where they are happening. We certainly have in the International Labour Organization an important line of work going on that is quite based on social dialogue, a tripartite approach, so unions, employers, governments, that is anchored also on the broader ILO agenda of social justice and decent work, and the connection between decent work and environmental environmental protection and climate change, broadly speaking. We also have, in parallel, sometimes connected, sometimes less so, in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, around the COPs, we have this work stream that has developed around just transition, with a very strong focus on workers and the creation of decent work that has been approved, validated within the Paris Agreement, and also the incipient currently being negotiated work around the Just Transition Work Program, that we are going to know better at the end of this week what the actual scope is going to be, but very likely is going to broaden from a single approach and single coverage of just transition for workers to incorporate that element, of course, but also incorporate, as per the mandate that they received last year, elements related to other aspects of the social and economic dimension of just transition, and extremely important also, a connection between climate action and development needs and social justice needs, and how those come up, and how climate action comes up in the intersection with the fighting against inequalities and the broader development agenda. And we can touch on that later, maybe in the Q&A, if there is interest on this UNFCCC dimension. I think it's also quite important to note that there are many, many more initiatives, not necessarily policy-making initiatives, but clearly practice-making initiatives happening as well at the international financial institutions. The Asian Development Bank, for example, has been developing its own package, let's say, of approaches related to just transition. Similar approach also in UNDP. We are also seeing other banks like the African Development Bank and other multilateral banks developing their own just transition ideas. And I would say capturing almost a very minimalistic version of just transition that is often reduced to participation at some point in time in the conversation on the transition. So it's clearly reducing the scope and the transformative ambition potentially of the concept. I think the just energy transition partnerships then need to be understood in this broader context of the concept of just transition, and also in parallel, the energy transition conversation, like flourishing, if we want to be optimistic with the metaphor, all around the multilateral system. That being said, it's not what we could consider a multilateral approach. It's what is being called a minilateral approach, in the sense that it is an agreement, it is a deal or an initiative that has been developed by what is called International Partners Group. And this is basically a subset of G7 countries plus a few others, depending on who is the partner country on the developing country side. And for the moment, we have 4 JETPs, South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the most recent one, Senegal, all in very different stages of development. Broadly speaking, their goal has been announced to be like a fund mobilization effort to accelerate decarbonization. I would say specifically the retirement of coal, so it's not all decarbonization, with some idea of developing new economic opportunities for the signatory countries. There are, though, quite a few differences between those just energy transition partnerships, and we tried to summarize here the promises that were made, and this is for you to have a sense. I think it's quite important also to capture the volume of the promise, the 8.5 billion for South Africa, 20 billion for Indonesia, around 15 for Vietnam, and a little bit less, 2.5 billion for Senegal. But let's be very clear that this nowhere is to be seen that this is a promise of public funding or grants. This is much more of a promise for mobilizing, and at least half of all these amounts is supposed to be coming by a matching from the private sector. The objectives also of each JETP is framed in a slightly different way. So in some places is about decarbonizing or moving away from coal. In other cases is particularly focused on electricity. In other places is like in Senegal, and this is a little bit of an odd one compared with the previous 3, is touches on coal, but also brings the element of gas. Which it makes the whole narrative about decarbonization also a little bit less clear from a story of the JETP's perspective. So I guess we wanted to start sharing some of the elements that came out from these conversations that Tetet was referring to. And basically, we focused or we tried to cluster those reflections and also some of the proposals around the three aspects of the JETP. I mean, justice, the J in the JETP is the energy transition, the ET, and the P, the partnerships, which is much more connected to the governance of it. So when it comes to justice, I think, and this is an overriding concern, I mean, for most of the, for all of the JETPs to date, is the strong concern over the lack of transparency that we have over the process, its terms, its timelines, the content of the deals, and the extremely limited civil society consultation. And I'm talking here about civil society in its broadest possible terms. I'm talking here about consultations with trade unions, consultations with NGOs, with community organizations, or at the territorial level. There are also, I mean, there was clearly also a sense from many of the conversations, in particular for the oldest JETPs, South Africa and Indonesia, the sense that there was no clear objective or outcome expected on social justice in these JETPs. And as you know, if you don't have a goal, how you measure progress on that end. So the idea that, yes, decarbonization is the goal, and the J has no indicator of success. And therefore, yes, basically a struggle to ensure sufficient resources were allocated to that part. There is also, and probably it was coming quite strongly in the South African case again, because it has now, we are entered almost, I mean, in the third year of the partnership, and basically we have many more documents and yes, a better understanding from civil society and academia on where they are standing. A concern on the focus, at the very strong focus on private sector, in particular when it comes to the ownership element. And I will come back to that also, to ownership elements, in particular of the, how we say, the extent to which this initiative is actually owned by society, and how much of this is just being driven by some private sector interest, or at least those elements not being necessarily balanced. And this leading then to a choice in terms of investments under JETPs that is extremely driven by the spaces where the most profit can be made, in particular by international or foreign companies that could come and use the JETP as an investment vehicle, I mean, in those emerging economies. Again, I mean, I leave it up to you to consider whether profit-making initiatives, I mean, are necessary or not. I mean, we are not taking that necessarily a position on that, but there is the fact that some of those choices seemed at odds with some very clear necessities from people in those countries. For example, the strong push for electrification of vehicles in South Africa, I mean, being prioritized over the deployment, development, investment in public transit and public transportation, for example. So based on that, and we've done this for the 3 dimensions, what we are suggesting and what we were discussing with civil society and researchers was to try to narrow down the amount of questions we would like to assess, or the dimensions we would like to assess the JETPs when it comes to this justice element, dividing them in 2 big clusters of justice. One related to procedural justice and the way in which the JETPs are built, but also the other one in terms of distributive justice and what are the outcomes of the JETPs from a justice, and in particular a social and ecological justice perspective. So I'm not going to read those questions, but what you can see is that there is very strong emphasis on measuring the JETPs or assessing the JETPs based on who has a seat at the table and how much they are involved, and also how resources are being allocated from an outcome perspective. I will move a little bit faster.
Anna, as much as your presentation is super important and interesting, You have to remind you about the time, huh?
5 minutes, or even a bit less, because people might have read the report. Energy transition wise, there is the element related to the connection between decarbonization and the bigger development agenda. I mean, like in terms of energy access, sustainable development, poverty eradication, macroeconomic concerns, and also the concerns related to the approach to electricity markets. On this, again, we have clustered some of the dimensions connected to who's driving the strategy and how this is connected to other national priorities in the recipient country. Then what ideas of the electricity market are actually embedded in the way investments are being guided. And then there is, of course, the element of implementation and who's the beneficiary. And the final point is about partnerships. How much of a partnership are just energy transition partnerships? In particular, in 3 areas, the element of governance. And this is not only applicable to the recipient country, also when it comes to the power relationships between donor countries and recipient countries, the element of finance as well. I mean, to what extent conditionality is on the table, the share of grants and loans, which are elements that are coming across extremely strongly from all those involved in JETPs. And here again, you have the different dimensions of the partnerships. Finally, I think like it's important to also assess, in particular with the voices in the recipient countries, how do we think together about advancing alternatives as well to the development model based on extractivism. And this is what JETPs could do if well designed, and imagine those pathways fitting within planetary boundaries. So our main takeaway is that it would be really important to, now that we have these dimensions, we start moving into deep research so that we can help civil society in particular access information that right now is quite difficult to access, and also start supporting that convergence that with some public pressure could help improving JETPs. I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Tetet.
Thank you so much, Anna, for walking us through the many different facets of the JETPs and the many concerns emerging so far from the lens of justice, energy transition, and partnerships, and also for, leaving us with the note of how do we make sure that its potential is realized for the benefit of people and planet. So I'm sure there will be questions for you in a bit, but now let's move on to our next panelist. Srestha Banerjee is the director of the India Just Transition Center at iFOREST, the International Forum for Environment, Sustainability, and Technology. Her current areas of work include climate change and just transition, mining and benefit sharing, environmental justice, and participatory governance. Srestha has over 12 years of experience working with Indian and US-based environment and public policy think tanks, and has been advising policy institutions and government agencies at national and state levels. Srestha holds a master's in environmental studies from Ohio University and a PhD in environmental and energy policy from the University of Delaware. So super expert. Srestha, let's be controversial. India is an interesting case as it decided not to sign on to a JETP. Can you tell us what happened and what the current situation is? How do the dimensions of the JETPs introduced in the policy brief apply to the just energy transition conversation in India? Over to you, Srestha.
Thanks, Tete, and Anabella. Great to see you, Dunga, as well. So, let me just get straight to the point, because this year at the COP, JETPs have been one of the driving forces of some of the documents that had been released. Just 2 days back, South Africa released their Just Energy Transition Implementation Plan based on the investment plan they proposed last year. And also Indonesia has come up with their policy and plan for just transition for the next 5 years. Now, India last year was quite, one of the prospective countries for getting into the JETPs soon after it happened with Vietnam. But the challenge is that, one of the challenges with the JETPs right now, and I think this is where India needs to take a cautious step, is that many of these JETPs have been signed, and all three of them. I'm not very sure of Senegal's way of getting the numbers, but Indonesia, Vietnam, and to begin with South Africa, they were very negotiated amounts. It was a lump sum amount when 8.5 billions, at the sidelines of Glasgow. We also, everyone was very happy about it, news headlines, but within a year, the president was, giving a press conference just before last year's COP that they needed at least 100 billion, and 8.5 billion was just a drop in the ocean. And what South Africa was actually doing at that time was that money went entirely into stabilizing the grid and upgradation of some of the infrastructure. That's it. So India, one of the political discussions, there are two things which has held India back, and it is not really advancing. One is that the ways that the JETPs are being negotiated and the amounts are clearly, insubstantial, I would say, considering what India may need. The second thing is that also the way the financing is happening, because we have all looked into South Africa and Indonesia in the last 2 years. And the first time in South Africa, it came out very clearly that 97% was through loans in various forms and very little amount of grants, 97, 98. So clearly, one of the things that Anabella presented was any partnership for climate, because these are all developing countries which are quite economically disadvantageous in many ways, and particularly the fossil fuel regions. So it should not increase the debt burden further of these countries, and getting into these loans, too much of loans can be a challenge. The second problem with loans is also that most of the loans need to have a return on investments, and that's the kind of investments we are seeing that is happening in both South Africa, Indonesia. We are yet to see right now, but it is therefore what we are seeing in largely development of energy infrastructure, very frankly. Very little investments on labor, very little investments on economic diversification, which is a very critical issue. In fact, not just to support just transition, but to secure the community buy-in, to get their confidence in the process, because it is a huge, the just transition is fundamentally a question of a socio-economic transformation, and we are today asking for a fundamental change in how the economic system in these countries are functioning, basically for India like a fossil fuel dependent economy. So it's a very difficult question to take to communities in a little amount of time and secure their buy-in or confidence in the process, which essentially means that their jobs can go tomorrow. So I think one of the fundamental investments just transition needs is investments in economic diversification and social infrastructure development. And that will help people to understand that, okay, there's some positive thing. Otherwise, it's a very, very difficult question. And I think the JETPs in their current scope does not provide that ample opportunity. So that is another limiting factors. Now, only, I can come back to all of these in my next intervention, but just one thing I would like to mention, Tete, that we have now undertaken, and we are going to actually do a global launch of that report on December 21. We have done a cost estimation of just transition for India, because one of the fundamental things we thought was lacking, in fact, not just JETPs, but there will be clearly need of international financing in whatever form it is going ahead. But before we get into any of these, the fundamental thing that is currently lacking is how do we estimate the costs? And we have done that cost estimation only related to this transition of the coal mining and coal-based power sector, which are the key focus of so far the Paris Agreement. And even going by that measure, and we are not getting into all the grid stabilization, all that aspects. We have looked at 8 cost components of just transition, like economic diversification, green energy investments, repurposing, repowering, labor transition, some sort of planning, governance issues. And what is fundamentally coming out is, at least for these 2 sectors, India needs more than $1 trillion over the next 3 decades. And that is not even taking into costs of, as I said, grid stabilization, anything of that sort. Now, and what is interesting in our assessment is that more than 40% of this cost is related to, economic diversification, worker transition, resilience, community resilience, planning, and all of that, which largely requires grants and subsidies. That is the key question. And the problem right now is that we do not see that in the JETPs. So therefore, I would say that definitely international cooperation is necessary. And I have been listening this COP, I just came back yesterday. But there are conversations from Indonesia that it has helped to bring different parties to the table. For example, France is sitting with South Africa discussing this, how the countries are coming together, which I feel is important. But at the same time, we need to be cautious about first understanding what it will require and what are the components that will definitely need, subsidies or grants from these countries or, institutions, all these IFIs we are talking of, and what amount will need to come from investments. And we need to balance between the two, because what is coming out, in fact, if you see Indonesia, as I'm sure many of you have seen now, the first 5 years, it is completely about, again, stabilizing electricity system, like, infrastructure and renewable energy investments. These are important, but there is nothing beyond that in the first 5 years of Indonesia's plan. So, so that is something I believe that will be important for India, given that, we have over 20 million workers at least who are dependent on various fossil fuel industries, and it is spread across more than 120 districts of this country. And these districts have some of the poor development indicators as compared to many of the, richer parts of the country. So considering the per capita income, social, and therefore the vulnerability is extremely high. Therefore, we really need to understand the components of welfare investments that can come in through international partnerships before getting into any of these. So I'll stop to that and I'll come back. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Srestha. I think you really hit the nail on the head in terms of raising, several red flags. What do we need to consider when talking about, transitioning, but in the end, it's causing the increased debt burden for developing countries. And we do know that it's not just an issue of repayment, but also the conditionalities attached to these loans. And now here in Dubai, we've been hearing developed countries, make a stronger push for Article 2.1c, which is about making finance flows consistent with low carbon pathways. It sounds nice, but then again, it really has to be interrogated deeply, more critically, because in the end, who is going to shoulder the cost of these transitions? Now, what is the cost of these transitions? Which is, I guess, a very nice segue to our third speaker, David Boyce, who everybody knows is the Deputy General Secretary of Public Services International and has worked in the labor movement for more than 30 years. He joined PSI in 1999 to support the water and energy sectors with an initial focus on stopping the scourge of privatization. He has steered successful global water campaign, supporting national unions, developing and nurturing union alliances with civil society, and fighting the World Bank structural adjustment policies, those conditionalities that are usually attached to loans. David helped form the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, or TUED, for the labor movement to tackle the many issues of public ownership and control of energy systems, transition to low carbon generation, and the appropriate integration of renewable energies. So David, if you can turn your camera on and show us your fierce, beautiful face. The conversation showed there was a growing concern about the model promoted to grow renewable energy in JETP countries. Can you tell us more as to what should we be concerned about and what potential alternatives should we be seeking to promote? Over to you, David.
Thanks, Tetet. Thanks to RLS, UNRISD, and of course my good comrades and friends Tetet and Anabella, who we've been going down the same road of social justice for a number of years. And admittedly, Anabella has dragged us down the road of climate justice, a little bit screaming and yelling. But we're getting there, Anabella. It's slow and it's a long road, but we sure as hell don't have a lot of time. Look, Tetet, thanks for those words of introduction. It's true, the labor movement has a specific perspective on just transition, as we both stand to lose a lot of really good jobs and we stand to build new good jobs. But clearly losing a job when you're the head of a household and you have people depending on you is not something that anybody likes, and trade unions are especially equipped to make sure that job losses don't happen too deeply or too often. Now, look, everything is turning electric. Everybody wants everything electric. All of you all who are traveling all over, you've probably got a bag full of cables and batteries and everything you plug in all the time. Everybody's talking about everything electric. So to get electricity, you have to generate it, you have to transmit it, and distribute it. And so generation is actually, I'm constantly surprised at how old technology is. Basically, most of it is you heat water to spin a turbine between some magnets and copper wires and create electricity. Transmission is the high voltage, which if you touch it, you're dead. And that happens to way too many electricity workers. Allows you to move a lot of electricity down to a substation where you step it down and so that they can distribute it to your home. Typically, this requires large investments over decades in each of these three pillars to build the infrastructure, machinery, and extend the wires to ensure that all households and all organizations can access this key element of human society. Production and supply of electricity on a large scale requires constant balance of inputs and outtakes. If any of them are out of balance, you will get a brownout or a blackout, and we know that as everything shuts down. Another consideration that we have to take on, Tetet, is fuel choice is an inherently political decision. So do you use coal, gas? Do you use solar, wind? Do you use geothermal? Those are political considerations. Access should not just be based on the ability to pay. We, as so many of us, take access for granted. And then finally, electrons are not the ideal market commodity, as an electron is an electron. Doesn't matter which logo the company puts on it, it's still just an electron. So what we've seen over the years, as Tetet hinted, is that when the private sector controls any of the three pillars, they exhibit oligopoly or monopoly behavior, allowing them to set prices to suit their profit requirements. And as we know, the for-profit actors basically must maximize profits in the short term. So my summary there is privatizing your energy systems is a recipe for disaster. But that doesn't mean that public is inherently good. A strong public utility depends on how strong your democratic institutions are. And that goes to a lot of the things that Anabella is trying to dig out on these JETPs. What we're asking for is democratic access. And look, a lot of us, it seems we don't even know what that means anymore. So do our elected officials respond to the needs of people and planet, or are they protecting the richest and their profits? So good public energy utilities, first of all, they respect the rights of the workers who operate the damn plants, okay? They don't outsource us. They don't try to screw us out of our wages and overtime. They give us the tools so we don't fry ourselves on the wires, and they make sure there's enough staff. They ensure proper maintenance. But they also have social access pricing so that people who can't afford to pay can still get access. And they're paying attention to fuel choices and climate considerations. And Tetet, the problem that we've seen over the past decade is that this whole notion that, oh, if we've got a public utility that is using either hydro or fossil or whatever to generate electrons, if we're going to go into wind and solar, we got to give that to the private sector. And what's the reason? I mean, I get really frustrated when I hear these ideological policy positions that say, if you're going to do wind and solar, you have to do it private. It makes no sense. So, you know, a strong utility can either invest in developing new research or can access new technologies. And those are out there. They do depend on solid basic research done in mainly public universities. Typically, that is then transformed in the private sector to give us the specific components of each element of electricity. But for me, this whole notion that we've got to get the private sector to tell us how to do what we know needs to be done, yeah, I'll try to be polite here, is absolutely ideologically biased. And so we need to, when we go back home, we need to look at what our public utilities are doing, who gives them the mandate, what our public investment banks are doing, who gives them the mandate, and then we've got to continue this work on the JETPs because I'm afraid it's a pretty twisted model. Anabella uses nice academic terms. I normally use a lot crustier terms, but I'm afraid that from what we can see of JETP, it's a twisted model of neo-colonial, pro-private, greater debt. But that's me. I'm not an academic, so let's use that for further debate. But that's basically my spin on this, and I don't trust it for a second. But yes, we do need to transition away from fossils. Thanks.
Thanks, David. And that's why we love you so much. You're very colorful and irreverent, no? You say it like it should be said. So I'm very glad that you're not a diplomat, or maybe you should be a diplomat.
Tetet, I didn't use any swear words because normally when I talk about this stuff that pisses me off, I actually use swear words. Because as a kid, I actually worked in the oil fields in Canada. And I tell you what, every other word starts with the letter F and has do or S and has do. And normally when I get angry like this, I swear. Anabella knows, but I behaved this time.
Mm-hmm. And of course, for good reason, because the usual arguments we've heard and continue to hear, it's about portraying private sector as the engine of growth and development, the saviors. They're really pushing very hard on that narrative. And as you rightly said, political considerations that must be front and center of transitions, taking note that it should be rooted in justice and democratizes access and enjoyment of fundamental rights. So thanks very much for that. And I think we do have some questions already from our friends in the audience. So maybe I'll just read them to aloud, and I give all three of you the opportunity to respond to one or whatever, no? So the first question is, why is there no clear goal of social justice in South Africa and Indonesia? Second is specific to Srestha. Can you clarify what you're saying, that Indonesia does not have a matching social protection plan to address the employment and income implications of the transition? And then now we have 4 questions. The third question is, how much emphasis is there on number 1, technology transfer, and 2, global value chains linkage development in existing JETPs? As for the rest, given that they are essentially presented as part of climate finance, is there any mention of additionality? And then the last question we have so far, how do we use these insights to disrupt the Energy Charter Treaty? So those are the 4 questions for our 3 panelists. Happy to turn over the microphone to all of you.
Maybe I'll just clarify on the Indonesia part. I'm not very sure that I said that Indonesia does not have a social protection plan. What I meant, we are talking here the just energy transition plans that are being developed around the pledges um, for Indonesia, which is uh, about 10, 12. Right now, they're just trying to figure out. But what I meant was that what was JETPs like? And in fact, the Indonesia's Just Energy Transition Policy Plan, I think the name of the document is, it's already in public domain. So, you might want to look at it. Uh, it has 6 components which are very much focused on energy. Now, just transition, we all also need to really understand that it is not just about JETPs which can drive just transition fundamentally. And if we look around the world, how any transition has happened, and if we think of the fossil fuel transition, it needs strong domestic institutions and governance mechanism, laws for this to happen. Number one, if we talk of labor, for example, it's true for any developing countries for that matter. The fundamental thing you need is very strong labor laws and social welfare measures to support the informal workers. No JETP can do that. And even when we talk of labor support, it's largely, when we look at developed countries, it has largely been around formal workers, because it's more quantifiable, it's more easy to do. You can map those labors, you can train them, do their skill mapping. But the challenge becomes informal workers, and for countries like India, which is huge, similar problems in Indonesia, South Africa, these require social protection measures. Now, the JETPs, in their sense, I'm not very sure uh, have the mandate to do that also, because it is more about, we all know, resource mobilization. And therefore, to provide for all these, we need 2 things. One is, definitely we would like from the JETPs the investments that can support more social welfare measures. But to ensure that it gets instituted, because see, money can only deliver if you have a strong governance mechanism, if you have strong laws, and if you have monitoring and enforcement and everything around. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Therefore, JETPs are not an end in itself to deliver just transition in any country, even in its best possible manner. The thing every country will need is their own policies, their own plans, and then our own institutional mechanisms to ensure that the money that is coming through JETPs or any other means is being utilized well. And that's why I don't think in the JETPs we have looked into the scope of Indonesia having good social plan, or it definitely the country, and I think we need to look into it, how Indonesia is balancing their own policies and priorities, and how they are going to use the JETPs, the money right now mobilized to that, to take forth the just transition. But I really do not mean that they do not have it as of yet. Thank you.
Thanks for the response, Srestha. And yes, Anabella, I was gonna come to you.
Yes, I mean, and thank you so much, Srestha and David, also for the yes, your comments. I think they are. I took a lot of notes. I mean, I'm like, yes, there's a lot to discuss here, but probably going to the questions. I think there was one question about why there is no goal on social justice. And I think it's also, this relates to the tension between just transition strategies in the country when there are. I mean, like, for example, in the case of South Africa, there was a just transition vision developed that had very clear goals when it comes to social justice, the connection to other challenges South African had, that was discussed at community level, like building up a real vision of just transition with a South African heart, with unions involved and many others. And then the JETP came afterwards, but as a sort of parallel adventure, let's say, where the logic or the shaping up is very different, because basically you have, as we were saying at the beginning, a funding mobilization goal. Then governments develop a just energy transition investment plan. And this is what just came out from Indonesia, for example, after 1 year of development. In South Africa, it came out last year. And from the just energy investment plan, you get this list of projects that are funded or get funding within the investment plan. So basically, and then those projects might or might not have a social justice objective, but then it's at the project level that you find the social intention when it exists. Because again, those investment plans, and in particular the projects selected, are somehow responding to what funders can fund. What we were hearing from South African colleagues is, well, the US does, for example, export credits. So it's not alone, but basically what they do is, well, we are going to give our resources through these private companies that are from the US to do these investments of your investment plan. So it's actual money that is never gets to the South African government. I mean, it's a mobilization, vehicle for some foreign investment into South Africa. So the social element is just at the project level when there is, and this is why most of the people in the conversation said that we should identify this gap very clearly, because it's needed at a higher level in terms of planning. And the other thing I would just like to add, there were several questions, but the whole point on technology transfer and global value chains is not very present, at least in what I've come across in terms of the JETPs, but it's a very important part of the just transition conversation happening right now in the UNFCCC. So I think this is where I think that the role of this Just Transition Work Program could be as well, as a way to start governing what is actually happening on just transition in some of those minilateral agreements. Of course, the UNFCCC will never dominate bilateral agreements, but at least it sets a framework of some minimums that could be there, and hopefully also support the creation of some mechanism that could imply, for example, challenging intellectual property rights on clean tech, that could think together in terms of the financing mobilization for a just transition. I'll stop there, but there were many more questions, but I can leave a couple to David as well.
Yes, let's leave one of the harder questions to David, no? So there's one coming from our friends. In your view, David, what is the concrete space and the activable provisions for shaping the JETPs towards the just transition that we really need, the one that we really are pushing for? Because that's the thing, just transition has been so mainstream. It's been so mainstream that it's been diluted from being an activist social movement alternative. Now everyone says just transition. So what is, David? Tell us.
Yeah, and that question is from our comrade Nassim, I believe also at RLS, who's also very connected into social justice. And he knows a piece of many pieces of the answer. So thanks for the provocative question. And look, if you try to isolate energy production from what's happening in the rest of society and all of the distortions that we have built as humans in society over the past couple of 100 years, if you try to isolate energy and have this techno-financial discussion about that, you're going to miss the big game. And the big game is we've got to have social justice writ broadly. We've got to address a whole range of elements of this fossil-intensive, capital concentrating, neo-colonial, male-dominated. I mean, there are just so many things we have to unpack, and so it is dangerous, albeit necessary, to isolate, as it were, energy from this bigger issue. And there's so it requires all of you all, first of all, make sure when you go home you join a union, because you got to be strong together, but also make sure you pay attention to what's going on in the cities you live in. But Tetet, let me just touch on a couple of the other questions. European Charter Treaty is crumbling under its own contradictions, especially the investor-state dispute settlement. European Charter, the Energy Charter Treaty was drawn up to protect investors who were supposed to go into the Central Eastern European, formerly Soviet satellite countries and modernize and increase energy production. The strange thing is that the Energy Charter Treaty is dissolving in Europe, but it's still being pushed in developing countries. And that's, again, about protecting investors. And that's in part the answer to some of the questions about Indonesia. Indonesia's global policy priority is saying we are friendly to investors. And that has a whole range of other knock-on effects. Finally, public funding. How do we get it? Well, look at the tax evasion globally. And I especially want to congratulate our comrades in Africa who have pushed on this for decades, such that now the African members of the UN General Assembly may finally force the UN to update global tax law, which hasn't been touched in over 100 years. And maybe we will get elements of tax justice, but we also have to deal with the global billionaires, the big private equity funds, the BlackRocks, and of course, Tetet, as you well know, we have to deal with debt burdens. And finally, comparing public versus private. Comparing bad public with good private is a trap. A well-managed public utility is a learning utility. The notion of competition used to sell the same electrons brings you down into a rabbit hole where you end up marketing. You end up spending hundreds of millions on marketing to convince people your electrons are better than the others. Those are my few comments because we are running short of time. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. If you could take some moments to, respond to those questions in the Q&A box, but I think and I feel that you've already alluded to some of those, no? So maybe at this point, we would just like to express our deepest appreciation to the panelists. Thank you so much, Anna, Srestha, and David. Of course, the UNRIS team and its partners, and everyone who has attended this webinar. I'm sure this is just, the beginning of a further conversation that we could, we should be taking around the JETP. So thank you so much. And we will be having a recording and sharing the recording of this webinar. And please, we do remind you to take the exit survey after this webinar ends. So thank you very much, and onwards to justice in transitions.
Thank you, Tetet.